course of the past year. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Just now, we had a special treat to hear about the end of the Torah before we might usually. And Isabel, those images beautifully demonstrate what happens in that moment as the Israelites say goodbye to Moses. In your words, the people lose their direct connection to God. And until this point, Moses has been their conduit for communicating with the divine. In the biblical imagination, the way of bringing something eternal into human experience is through the voice of prophets. When I say something eternal, I mean eternal truths. Moses was a prophet par excellence because according to tradition, he wrote down the Torah, the most significant eternal truth of the Jewish people. And all of us non-prophets, if you will, are just stuck here trying to make sense of it. Maimonides, the great 12th century rationalist, taught that prophets weren't magical people. They were human beings that just happened to be so clever or so righteous, perhaps, that they were able to tap into truths of the universe that everyday people couldn't understand. Now, we human beings want to understand the world. We want to know what we don't know. We want to get at deep truths about the world. And unfortunately, according to the rabbis, prophecy ended once the Bible ended. So we're kind of stuck out here on our own, looking to those earlier prophets, as you taught us, Isabel, for some kind of guidance, trying to parse the words or their words for truth that we can understand. In our pursuit of truth, without prophets, we look to prophets for some answers. And we also perhaps look for examples for how to seek truth in our own life. Even if we aren't going to get at prophetic truths, we can find some kind of truth. But in your Parsha, Ivy, in Parshat Balak, we actually get an example of what not to do from the prophet Balaam. He's not a false prophet per se, so much as a foil, an example of prophets gone bad. And by comparing Balaam's experience to that of Moses, we see that whether we're talking about prophets or regular human beings, there's at least one wrong way of trying to get to the truth. As you taught us, this week's Torah portion describes a Moabite king named Balak, who orders a Midianite man, Balaam, to go and curse the Israelite people. So Balaam goes to see what God thinks about the whole situation, and God emphasizes that there's no use trying to curse the Israelites since they are only to be blessed. Balaam tries to explain this to the Moabites, but they convince him to come along with them anyway. You get the sense that Balaam is at first unwilling to go about this errand, but still, he does go along with Balak's request. And as he communicates with God, there's something that isn't quite right. Now, strictly speaking, Balaam is a successful prophet. God talks to him, and he talks to human beings, offering truths about the Israelites in human speech. But despite this fact, in the book of Joshua, Balaam is described as a sorcerer, not as a prophet at all, but somebody who tried to manipulate the supernatural for human purposes. And this was his mistake. When you look at other examples of biblical prophecy, typically you find the phrase Devar Adonai, the word of God. In Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, and others, this is the way that prophecy appears. The word of God came to each of these men. But this phrasing doesn't appear, at least not early on, and not in exactly that form in the story of Balaam. The Hebrew that appears most notably in relation to him is the unusual verb vayikar. Vayikar Elohim el Balaam, and God manifested before Balaam. It doesn't say God spoke to him as it typically does with prophets like Moses and Abraham in that verse. And it doesn't say a word of the eternal came upon him as it does with the later prophets. The text goes out of its way to use a neutral phrase. God manifested before him. Later, rabbinic commentaries will say this isn't so neutral at all, but actually it's something negative. That verb is sort of like indigestion or something bad that happens to you all of a sudden beyond your control. Not something positive you would expect from a prophet. But even without looking into the wordplay, you can look at the plot to see something important and unusual about Balaam's relationship with God. and something which I think offers us a cautionary tale in our own pursuit of truth. Before God manifests, Balaam responds to Balak by saying, "I'll go out, whatever God tells me, I will tell you." Balaam actively seeks out God's information. That's not true of other prophets like, say, Abraham, who hears a call and then goes forth. Nor is it true of Moses, who famously wondered if he was really worthy of receiving the important task of leading the people at all. Later prophets, too, tended to reject the mantle of divine intermediary, but Balaam went out looking for it. And he did so with a specific truth in mind that he was expecting to manifest. The reason that the book of Joshua and many rabbinic texts refer to Balaam as a sorcerer is that he went out seeking information from God, perhaps intending to change God's mind, without understanding that a prophet is merely someone who accepts the truth. He knew that the people were destined only for blessing, and yet he didn't adequately stand up to Balak's request to curse them. More to the point, whether or not Balaam wanted to be in this position, he misunderstood that his role as a prophet was never to curse the people, nor to change God's plan. It was just to convey truths, even if those truths might have been unpleasant. To emphasize his mistake, the Parsha includes a little theatrical mischief, as you pointed out, on the part of the biblical writers. The episode with Balaam's donkey demonstrates that Balaam isn't so much of a seer at all as you taught us. If even his donkey can see an angel of God standing right in front of him, while he can't. When self-interest gets in our way, this seems to suggest, we can be blinded by the truths, and rather to the truths that we supposedly seek. Sometimes when we go out looking for a truth, we think we know what the truth is before we find it. I'm guessing some of us here can relate to this experience. Sometimes when we read something or argue about something, we start out from a conviction that we already know what is right. Or even if we feel insecure that a position we take is the right one, sometimes we double down on our beliefs because we're too stubborn to have our minds changed or to be proven wrong. But this is the mistake that Balaam makes. He isn't guided by intuition nor inquiry, and he isn't guided by a call from God the way that other prophets are. He's guided by a very human impulse to prove himself, and he's encouraged on by a human king who's trying to stay in power. These are not the right motivations behind prophecy, and they're not the right motivations for seeking or speaking answers in our time. Rather, what we learn here when it comes to prophecy or when it comes to finding truths in the modern day is that truth is not something we can manipulate. Deriving a truth requires humility, accepting the process that we are not in control. And sometimes the truths we find are inconvenient. But like prophets, it's not within our power to change inconvenient truths so much as accepting truths as truths and then sharing those truths in the service of making the world more whole. Ivy and Isabel, as you go on through your lives as Jewish adults, may truths be revealed to you more and more each day. May you continue to have your eyes opened to things that were always before you, perhaps, but which you see anew. When those truths are painful, may you have the courage to address them in ways that make the entire world more whole. May all of us have that courage, and may that truth lead us to blessing. Shabbat shalom.